Springtime is here, which means it's time for the SEC to engage in its favorite annual debate, a debate that's been going on for more than a dozen years now. 8 games in the conference schedule or 9 games in the conference schedule? Yeah, that's right. We're doing this again. The SEC is debating whether to go to a 9-game conference schedule in the 2026 season. And wouldn't you know it, there's not agreement across on all fronts on what to do. Welcome in to SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John, you've covered this league just a little bit longer than I have. I came into covering the SEC around the time the 8 or 9 game schedule debate began. Can you remember a time when the conference wasn't debating this? Was there a time when the league was debating whether to play a conference schedule at all, or just play 1 or 2 games against the junior varsity? Or what are your memories of this long going debate?
It's funny. It's seemingly as if this has gone on so long that whatever came before, I've just lost. I can't even think of that world. I fully expect to be on my deathbed in 10 years, and I'll get a call from you and say, "Hey, John, before you go out, the SEC's decided to go to a 9-game schedule."
And then, boom. Just like that, you're out.
I'm gone. Yeah.
It's the thing you're hanging on for. But no, truly, I found I was wondering, when did this debate begin? Because I knew it's been going on for more than a decade. The earliest I could trace it back to was 2012. So that would be more than a dozen years ago now. Mike Slive was commissioner, and the 4-team playoff was on the horizon. And the SEC was thinking about going to 9 games, but they didn't know, is the playoff committee going to award to reward the SEC's strength of schedule enough to justify adding a 9th conference game? Well, would you know it, all these years later, some of the hesitance by some athletic directors, coaches, officials within the SEC, some are hesitant to go to a 9-game schedule because they're worried the CFP selection committee does not value strength of schedule enough. The playoff has now tripled in size. You got 12 teams in the playoff, but because some 3-loss SEC teams didn't get in this last year, there's a belief with some that the juice isn't worth the squeeze, basically. Now, John, here's where I fall on this. I don't think SMU should have been in the playoff this past year. I would have picked Ole Miss or BYU. I thought they had better resumes than SMU, so I think the committee flubbed on that front. However, I think it's disingenuous to say that the committee did not acknowledge strength of schedule when Indiana had a better record than several at-large teams, but was seeded worse than them. They had a better record than Texas, Tennessee, Penn State, Ohio State, but Indiana was seated behind them. Why? Because of strength of schedule. Also, Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, they were all ranked ahead of BYU despite having an inferior record, and Alabama was ranked ahead of Miami despite having an inferior record. Why? Because of strength of schedule. It's just that with a 12-team playoff, there wasn't enough room for Alabama, the committee decided. And so while I don't agree with the committee's choice of SMU, I also don't agree with the people out there that are kind of making a mountain out of a molehill here and acting like the committee didn't honor strength of schedule at all. They did honor strength of schedule, in my opinion, just not to the extent that some within the SEC would like it to be honored.
Yeah, well, one of the problems the SEC had last year were some early season non-conference games.
Mm-hmm.
Take care of business, and you're in really good shape. Texas A&M at home, a decided home field advantage against Notre Dame. Win that game, and it's a big blow for the SEC, not just A&M. A&M stunk up the joint.
Yeah.
Loses to Notre Dame, which turns around and loses to Northern Illinois, then goes on a rampage and ends up playing for the national title. But that was a shot right there, a great opportunity to eliminate some of the competition when we talk about these cherished playoff spots. And A&M had everything going for it with the home field advantage, and couldn't pull it off. And then another game, LSU and Southern Cal on a neutral site.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, Southern Cal's a nice opponent in that it always has talent. It's got a storied history. It's a marquee school, but it wasn't that good last year. And it still was good enough to beat LSU. Those were costly games for the SEC. Very costly.
Totally, John, because the trickle down effect of that matters too. LSU's bogged down by that loss to Southern Cal, but then when LSU beats Ole Miss, that loss looks like a little bit of a worse loss because LSU lost to Southern Cal. Or when Alabama beats LSU, doesn't look like quite as good of a win because LSU lost to Southern Cal. So there's that trickle down effect when you don't take care of business in the non-conference portion of your schedule. I think that's one part of it. I think the other thing too, John, just don't lose to Vanderbilt or Kentucky. I mean, I think Ole Miss had a better case than SMU, but it wasn't a hill I was going to die on because Ole Miss, let's face it, they lost on their home field to Kentucky. They were the only Power 4 team to play Kentucky that lost to them. Kentucky lost to every other Power 4 team. And then Alabama loses to Vanderbilt. Not only that, but gets beat by, like a drum by Oklahoma. 7 teams managed to beat Oklahoma. Alabama managed to lose by 21 points to Oklahoma. And so, yeah, I didn't love SMU's playoff case, but to me, it's just so disingenuous to not acknowledge that the resumes were very flawed by Alabama and Ole Miss. And quite frankly, the best thing they had going for them in their playoff debate was their strength of schedule. I mean, that's the thing that was keeping their playoff hopes afloat. That's the reason why Alabama was ranked ahead of Miami and why Ole Miss was ranked ahead of BYU was because of their strength of schedule. But those bad losses, I mean, I can't entirely blame the committee for having those bad losses in their mind. In a lot of ways, those teams blew it. And I actually thought, to Greg Sankey's credit, he went on the Paul Feinbaum show earlier this week, and he did make the point that the playoff selection committee did award some credit to the conference's strength of schedule. Now, I'm sure in a perfect world, Sankey would have liked even more credit for his teams for their strength of schedule. But I mean, we're not above criticizing Greg Sankey on this podcast, but I think credit where it's due. He acknowledged in that interview with Paul Feinbaum that yes, the playoff committee did award some acknowledgement of the SEC strength of schedule. It just wasn't enough to get Alabama and Ole Miss across the finish line. And so, to me, I guess do what you want in 8 games versus 9 games, but it's a little weak to me if the SEC stays at 8 to have the excuse be, well, we can't possibly do this because the schedule just be so hard. We can't get teams in the playoff. No, just beat Kentucky and Vanderbilt, and Alabama and Ole Miss could have both been in the playoff this past season.
You could make a case that Alabama's loss to Vanderbilt and Kentucky's win over Ole Miss, those 2 games were 2 of the most impactful in a negative way in recent SEC history.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing. The SEC always wants to say toughest conference in the country, top to bottom. And it often is. I don't deny that. We know that. However, when you're trying to make that case and you point, well, yeah, I know Ole Miss lost to Kentucky, but that just shows how tough the SEC is. No, I watched Kentucky play. That doesn't remotely resemble a good football team. And there's just no excuse for losing that kind of game. One of the things we talk about a lot in an expanded playoff field from 4 to 12, this sort of eliminates the fluke game. Gives you a second chance. Everybody might have a really bad day. Okay.
Such as Notre Dame losing to Northern Illinois.
Northern Illinois. You get
one
what?
mulligan.
Okay, so here you go. You got Ole Miss loses to Kentucky, and wouldn't you know it, it still has a shot to make the college football playoff and play for a national title. So what does it do? It goes down to the swamp, a Billy Napier-led team, and you know what that implies, and loses in the swamp to the Gators. Yeah, Florida was playing better at the time. Yeah, DJ Lagway's a good quarterback, but Ole Miss is a better team, and it had every opportunity in the world to win that game, and it's already got its mulligan. So now just go out, prove you belong. Do what South Carolina did against Clemson. South Carolina gets the job done against Clemson. Okay, here's your opportunity to prove yourself. You got a second chance, capitalize. Now, if it hadn't lost to Kentucky, the point would be moot. It wouldn't matter. But it did lose to Kentucky. And look at Alabama. You lose to Vanderbilt. I mean, come on. You lose to Vanderbilt? You could seriously, I mean, if you lose to Vanderbilt, do you really have any complaints that you didn't make the playoff?
And not especially when you get a mulligan and you lose by 21 points to an Oklahoma team that didn't have a pulse throughout the entire months of October and November up until that point. I mean,
yeah, it's so Alabama, like Florida, had a second chance. And what did it do with the second chance? I mean, it made Oklahoma look better by far than it had looked all season. Oklahoma had come close to playing a game like that. And I don't think it was a sudden emergence of the Sooners as a competent football team. I just think Alabama went out there to Norman and laid an egg and couldn't get it done. And so now it's out of the playoff.
Yeah. And then laid another egg to Michigan in the bowl game.
Yeah, just to show, okay, if we made our point now,
right.
We weren't a national championship contender, okay? We lost to Vanderbilt, we lost to Michigan, and we lost substantially to Oklahoma.
John, there were many years in which I was a staunch proponent of the SEC going to a 9-game schedule. I thought for years the SEC should be at 9. The Big Ten's been at 9. The Big 12 has been at 9. It's the SEC and the ACC are exceptions. And I think another reason to go to 9 would be you get more data points against each other, and it makes it a little easier for a playoff selection committee to recognize who the actual best teams are in your conference. It's one more data point you have against other teams in your league. Now, having said that, I don't know that I feel as strongly about the whole 8 to 9 thing as I used to. And here's why. Because you have some teams now in the SEC who have 2 Power 4 non-conference games scheduled. We saw this this past year with LSU. LSU did it with USC and UCLA. Let's look at this upcoming season. Say at Alabama. Alabama has Florida State and Wisconsin. You look out into the future, Alabama has multiple Power 4 opponents scheduled way out into the future. I mean, let's look out to 2027. Alabama has West Virginia and Ohio State on the schedule. 2029, they have Notre Dame and Oklahoma State on the schedule. And so if more teams in the conference were committed to doing that, and Alabama's not the only one, I just use them as an example, but if more teams in the conference were committed to scheduling 2 Power 4 non-conference opponents, I guess I wouldn't care as strongly about the whole 8 to 9 thing. I want more good games. I think we all want more good games. And I think the playoff committee, more times than not, recognizes what's real and what's fake. We can debate about 1 or 2 instances here and there, but for the most part, the cream rises to the top when it comes to playoff selection, right? And so, if the SEC agreed, we're going to stay at 8 games, but we're going to have everybody play 2 Big Ten teams every year. In an SEC Big Ten clash, you play 2 Big Ten teams every year, and they stick at 8 conference games. I'd say, hey, that sounds okay to me. That's pretty entertaining. Where are you at? Are you still rooted in on the 9 or 10 game conference schedule, or are you coming around to any idea of sticking at 8?
I've always preferred 9 or 10.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, and I buy in somewhat to the strength of schedule argument with the playoff committee, that if you weigh that more heavily, it, there's more incentive to schedule tough games within the conference and without. One of the problems I have now with the SEC scheduling is in a 16-team league, it's so large that forget non-conference opponents, you can have vastly different levels of competition in your schedule within the league. I mean, if you look at Oklahoma and Florida last year, be the same case this year. It's how difficult those conference schedules were for those teams, and compared to, say, Tennessee and Missouri. And there is no comparison. I mean, Tennessee would not have wouldn't have come close to making the college football playoff if it had Oklahoma's schedule. It just wouldn't have.
Yeah, and I think that's an argument, and I think I'm interpreting your point correctly here. That's an argument to play an extra conference game, because then you get to see a little bit more clearly who are the actual best teams in this conference. Now, I think a lot of this comes back to athletic directors prefer risk avoidance. If you can, swap in a cupcake in favor of a ninth conference game, well, that reduces your risk for an extra loss. But it also reduces the committee's chance, everybody's chance, to really see who are the best teams in this 16-team conference that the committee should be paying the most attention to. And that's one thing I will give the Big Ten some credit on, is by playing that ninth conference game, they're giving the committee another data point to see these are the best teams in the league. I mean, by selection day, I don't think there was any doubt who the 4 best teams in the Big Ten were. Now, we could debate whether Indiana should have been in or not, but Indiana had proven, even with a favorable schedule draw, they'd played 9 conference games, and I think they'd proven that they were the 4th best team in that conference. The committee recognized that. They recognized their 11-1 record. They put them in the playoff. I mean, if you had asked me last year who was the 4th best team in the SEC, I think that's a really tough question to answer. And without a clear answer to that, it made it easier for the committee, I think, to pick SMU. If you played more conference games, that would help more clearly identify for the committee, here's who the best teams in the conference actually are.
I do think if you go to the 9-game conference schedule, that eliminates those prominent non-conference games. There's just, if you're playing 12 games and you've got 9 games within the league, particularly if you have an in-state rival outside the conference, i.e. South Carolina with Clemson, Florida with Florida State, what's the point of scheduling another imposing non-conference opponent? There just isn't one. Now, Matt Rule of Nebraska has been very vocal about that. The Cornhuskers canceled their series upcoming with Tennessee, 26 and 27 games. It's all Nebraska can do to get in a bowl game. And Matt Rule is looking at that like, so now I'm supposed to play a playoff team in addition to the Big Ten teams I've got to play already. I just, what's the incentive? Why should I do that? Well, there really is none. So I have a hard time understanding what some of these schools in the SEC are thinking now, because they know the possibility exists of a 9-game conference schedule. And yet the way some of these schools are scheduling, I mean, we've got Texas is opening it at Ohio State this year. I mean, that's a national championship type game. You've got LSU going on the road at Clemson.
Counter argument, John, though, by playing a game like Texas going to Ohio State, if you happen to go 9-3, that does, I think, increase your argument to get a final at-large bid in the playoff. I mean, I think, look, I don't think we're going to have this 12-team playoff long term, but I think if we did, we wouldn't have to wait that long to see a 9-3 team in the playoff. We almost saw it this past year, and I think we would see it in the near future. I think it would be a team like in the scenario you're talking about, challenged itself in week 1 by playing on the road and against the defending national champions, and maybe finish 9-3. But you get credit for playing those type of games. Alabama and Ole Miss, frankly, didn't have that this past season. They did have strong strength of schedules, but they didn't play an Ohio State type team in the non-conference portion of the schedule, and maybe that would have put their argument over the top. Maybe not. I don't know what the committee would have done. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about this, John, is like neither one of us likes this auto bid debate that's going on for the playoff, like where we just predetermine before the season starts how many bids each conference gets. But if you want to just see teams play the toughest schedule possible, that is the argument from that camp, is you just brutalize each other throughout the regular season, and, well, who cares? Because you're going to have so many bids for your conference at the end of the year. That's the argument from that camp of going to the auto bid format. I don't think that's a strong enough argument to do it, but I do at least appreciate that that's the rationale from that camp, is you could eliminate all cupcake games and just have slobber knockers every week. And hey, you get 4 bids for the SEC and the Big Ten at the end, and the records are what the records are.
Yeah, in an ideal world, everything would be decided on the field there, but we will never reach that point in college football. It just won't happen. Doesn't matter how many teams you allow to go into the playoff. The thing about these games, though, I look at that Texas at Ohio State and LSU at Clemson. Yeah, you could be rewarded for playing that, but I wonder if you're rewarded enough.
That's fair.
Over the course of the season, because if you go 9-3, and let's just say Texas loses at Ohio State, or LSU loses at Clemson, and ends up losing 2 more games. Well, with 3 losses, to me, you're still in jeopardy there. That's no guarantee. You can say we played a really tough schedule. Yeah, well, you still lost 3 games. I just think, and what if one of those games is a real clunker? What if you have an Ole Miss versus Kentucky game, that kind of thing? Then you lose the value of playing that game. It's a troublesome issue, I think, and I don't think we're going to resolve it on our podcast. We do try to make this a better college football world, but we seek perfection, but we've yet to attain it.
It's interesting though, John. Chris Del Conte, the athletic director at Texas, was basically asked about scheduling Michigan on the road last season. Now, Michigan, wasn't what Michigan expects to be, especially early last season. But Texas didn't know that when they scheduled the game, and then now they have Ohio State on the road this season. And Chris Del Conte said, "quote, I'm not issuing a cupcake schedule. Our coaches and our student athletes aren't. They want to play the very best. We owe it to college football to play the very best," end quote. And I mean, I kind of like it. I don't know if it's smart, but I kind of like it to say, hey, we're going to go out there and play somebody, because that's what Texas football thinks it should be doing. And that's who we are. We're Texas. Go out and play the big boys. Now, there was a long time where Texas wasn't one of those big boys, but hey, they are now, and I kind of like that. Say
I like it. I like it too, But it's a lot easier to say that coming off back-to-back playoff seasons than
True.
if you're somewhere else. Look at Florida's schedule for 2025. Billy Napier, once again, as always, of course, is on the hot seat. He resides there permanently and will forevermore, I assume.
Yeah, he calls it his recliner. It's not a hot seat; it's just his recliner.
It's his getaway home. Uh, and some Florida fans want him to get away. So I look at this Florida schedule, the middle of its schedule. In succession, Florida plays without an open date, unless I've got the wrong schedule. Here's what I just checked: LSU, Miami, Texas, and Texas A&M.
Lord have mercy.
And that tells me that Florida wants to play the best, wants to be the best. That's who Florida is, right? That's if we listen to Del Conte's words carefully and his philosophy on this, that's what you would conclude from that schedule. That, hey, we're Florida football and we play the best and we'll beat the best.
Yeah, you make a fair point, John, that it's easier to have that mentality when you've been to the playoff 2 years in a row. When Steve Sarkisian's your coach, and when you have Arch Manning as your quarterback, you add all that up, and you can puff out your chest a little bit and say, we aren't playing cupcakes. And, oh, by the way, Texas will play 3 cupcakes in the non-conference portion of the schedule. It's just that their 4th non-conference game is Ohio State. So they're taking the approach of we're going to play 1 really hard non-conference game and 3 cupcakes, whereas some others in the conference have said, like, we're going to find that like sweet spot maybe of 2 Power 4 non-conference opponents, but nobody of the level of Ohio State. So there's multiple ways of getting at this, and the other part of this equation is we still don't know what the playoff format's going to be for 2026. So I think until we get some clarity on that, it does make it hard for athletic directors and presidents in the SEC to kind of decide what they want the 2026 schedule to look like in the conference when they haven't determined yet what the playoff format is going to be. So that's sort of holding this in limbo. But let's leave this one there, John. But I do want to spend a few minutes on the college hoops front. We'll get into this a little bit more next week, postseason approaching in the SEC, but we could dig into this just a little bit today. I'm wondering just a status check as you look around the conference. There's really 4 front runners within the SEC for a national championship. It's Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, and Alabama. And I'm wondering right now, I won't hold you to this. We can revise this a week from now. But right now, what would be your pecking order of those 4, their chances to win the whole thing? Let's go least chance to best chance of those 4. And then I'll follow up with another question about whether I'm missing anybody from that list. But how would you go least to best chance of winning it all with those 4 teams?
At least I'd start with Alabama.
Because they play no defense?
Yeah, I think it relies too much on 3-point shooting, and that can come and go. And I could see Alabama. I know it made the Final Four last year, and so that makes me think, well, it's less likely it will repeat, because to me that 3-point shooting, that heavy reliance on that, makes you very vulnerable sometimes against weaker teams in a possible early round upset. So I would scratch Alabama. I think the other 3 teams are more complete. Next, I would probably say Florida, the least likely. I've seen Florida be very good, and it's playing well now. But I still think I like Auburn and Tennessee more, I guess. I watched Florida beat Tennessee by 30 points and then lose to Tennessee by 20. And if they had a rematch, I would probably pick Tennessee. What I like about Tennessee is you can count on Rick Barnes' defense. That's unwavering. That's every time out. They're going to play really good defense. I mean, there's a rare exception here and there, but for the most part, really good defense. And what I like about his team this year, it has enough versatility. It has more of a post presence than it had last year on defense. which would have mattered significantly in a loss to Purdue and Zach Edey with the Final Four berth on the line. I think it would be more capable of winning that game. And one thing I've noticed about Tennessee is it's had different players step up and sort of elevate above what the scouting report says they're supposed to do. Jamal Mashak, who's nowhere near their best three-point shooter, for example, hit a game winner against Alabama. Things like that I've seen with this team. Auburn, to me, is just a complete team. I think it could win in any number of ways: offense or defense, three-point shooting, post play, you name it. I mean, it won without Janai Broom, a candidate for Player of the Year nationally, not just in the SEC. So, and Bruce Pearl's a really good coach. So, I really like Auburn, even though that said, it lost to Yale last year. So, let's face it, anytime you're trying to predict this tournament, you're on thin ice because things rarely unfold as they're expected to.
Wouldn't it be something, John, if Tennessee won the national championship with this team? Because I think this is a very strong team. They play great defense. But I would say if I were ranking Rick Barnes' best teams at Tennessee, I would probably have this one third. I think back to the Grant Williams Admiral Schofield team that spent a portion of that year ranked number one. And then I think back to last season when they ran into Purdue and Zach Edey in the Elite Eight. Tennessee had Dalton Connect. I think, just ran into Purdue buzzsaw in that situation. But I would probably have this team third of Rick's best teams at Tennessee. Wouldn't it be something if this is the one that breaks through, gets the first Final Four in Tennessee history, and then gets Rick Barnes a national championship? Am I missing something there? Would you have this team higher than the other two I brought up in the pecking order?
Well, you can't make that conclusion until the season is completely done.
Mm.
But I thought in preseason this could be Rick Barnes' best team. Then it lost J.P. Estrella, a 6'10 post guy with great potential, to a foot injury, out for the year. One of the things that's really impressed me about this team, aside from its versatility, not only does it play good defense, it plays good defense without lapsing into foul trouble. Some of Mike Krzyzewski's best Duke teams did that on their way to championships. This is not an especially deep team. It's an 8-man team basically, but these guys don't get in foul trouble that much. And I think that's really significant, particularly in the NCAA tournament. I just think it can do a lot of things well. It's got more 3-point threats than last year. It's got a classic 3-point shooter with a super quick release in Chaz Lanier, but it's got other guys who I would trust shooting a 3-pointer with the game on the line. And I didn't think it had that last year. And it's got a really experienced, hardened point guard in Zakai Ziegler, who has that great gift of making people better around him, an uncanny knack for finding the open player and moving the ball around and getting in the right spot, the right player in the right spot. He seems to make that connection. So there are just a lot of things I like about this team. And it was good enough to almost beat Auburn in Auburn. And you know how challenging that can be.
Yeah, last few years has been one of the biggest challenges in college basketball to beat Auburn in Auburn. So you're 1 through 4, John. Best chance to least chance of those top 4 of winning the national title was Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, Alabama. I'm wondering, so I introduced those 4, but you got a few others been in the top 25 rankings throughout the past several weeks. Missouri, Kentucky, Texas A&M. We know how deep this conference runs, and we've talked about before they might break the all-time record for most bids by a conference for the NCAA tournament. But would you, whether it be Missouri, Kentucky, Texas A&M, would you put any of those 3 teams ahead of either Florida or Alabama in the pecking order of best chance to win the whole thing?
I probably wouldn't put it ahead of them, but the way this tournament unfolds, it tells me that another team, not one of the top four, and those teams have earned their respect. They've earned their status. I don't argue with any of those teams being where you have them. Uh, I just think there's so much talent in this league and so many good teams that it wouldn't shock me if a number of teams I think are capable of making the Elite Eight, if not the Final Four. I thought it was interesting. Ole Miss coach Chris Beard, who's taken a team, not an Ole Miss one, to the national championship game, said, I know we won't be favored, but pretty much intimated that this team might be Final Four capable.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched it beat Tennessee the other night. So it's got a lot of weapons, and he's a proven coach. A lot of proven coaches in this league, and you know how it works in this tournament. Teams come together, they get momentum, and everything clicks. All these teams you mentioned, Missouri, Texas A&M, Kentucky, Ole Miss, when you watch those teams on their very best night, you could say, heck, that team might make the Final Four. To me, they have that kind of talent and that kind of potential. Now, of course, the key is consistency and sustaining that in a tournament run. But for one game, they can flash that kind of talent.
All right, John, we'll pick up the basketball conversation next week. Love this time of year with the conference tournament coming up and then March Madness. And I think we probably won't have an answer on the old 8 or 9 game schedule debate, considering that's been a debate that's been going on now for, maybe as long as you've been covering the conference, because we really still haven't definitively pinned down when that debate started. We just know it's a long, long time, which is great for us because it gives us something to discuss in this football off season. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.